This play is sponsored by the California Civil Liberties Public Education Program, a state-funded grant project of the California State Library.
And now, Hour 2 of A Good Day at Auschwitz by Stephen Tobolowsky, directed by Annalise Erikson, starring Alan Mandell and Stephen Tobolowsky.
One night at dinner, Simon said he wanted to come to America. He heard of a place called the Bronx. I thought, sure, why not? And then she came.
Who came?
Hanka from Auschwitz. She found us too. She stayed and had Sabbath dinner with us. She asked now that the war was over, would I like to marry her? I couldn't. In our village, the oldest in the family had to marry first. I was the youngest. I know it sounds crazy now, but it was a different world. We were trying to keep what little order we had left.
What happened to her, Abe?
She went to Israel. She's married and has 3 children. She's still alive. I know. I got a postcard from her last year with her picture. She's still very beautiful. To Hanka.
To Hanka.
That's only one, Steve. Remember, one is like none. So we need to have 2, which is like 1, which is like none. We'll have 3. How about that? 3 for Hanka.
3 sounds good.
I came to America with Simon. We ran a candy store in the Bronx, and I learned to drive a car.
What was that like?
Dangerous for everybody else. I had one signal. I stuck my hand out the window, and that meant, watch out, I'm about to do something.
So you lived with Simon?
Yes, we had an apartment. And in the morning we went to shul. In the evening we went to social clubs for Holocaust survivors. They were all over. Different ones for different towns in Europe. We would go and play cards or dominoes, have a drink at kibbutz. We figured maybe we would hear from people we knew.
Sure, makes sense.
Oh, more than you know. So who do you think walks in one night? 2 of my brothers.
No, Abe.
Yes. One had escaped through Russia, another through Holland, so now we were 4.
That's amazing.
You ain't heard the half of it. You know who else we found?
No idea.
You remember my uncle, the man who killed the Cossack? He was living in New Jersey. He said he escaped that night years ago and headed straight for America. He had 6 daughters. All of them became truck drivers. Imagine that. 6 girls, and all of them truck drivers.
Well, I guess if you do something well.
Oh, they did it well. I think they made a fortune. And one of his daughters...
The truck driver.
Right, the truck driver. She had a son who ended up playing for the New York Yankees, Buddy Mayerson.
You're kidding.
No. From our village to the Yankees. He was a wonderful player. He would have had a great career, but they didn't let Jews play much in the big leagues back then.
I looked at Abe's handwritten story he had given me. I put it aside and asked,
Abe, how do you think this could happen, that people could do this to other people?
Because they're bastards. It's that simple. They tortured us because they could.
But Abe, the Germans were educated.
Very.
They had poets like Heinrich Heine, composers like Beethoven, Bach, scientists, artists.
The works, it didn't matter. They wanted to kill us, so they found a way to do it.
Out of everyone you knew during that time, who was the best, the most impressive?
My 2 Germans. I would give them anything if I could see them today.
Who was the biggest son of a bitch?
That Jewish bastard on the Judenrat who gave me a double shift when he found out I was working for my sick brother.
Now, I thought you were going to say the Volksdeutsch who hit you with the shovel.
Oh, don't get me wrong. He was a real son of a bitch, too. He tried to kill me, but the other, there was no excuse for that. And it got him nothing.
Abe got up from his chair and shuffled to the kitchen for apple cake and a knife. As I watched him, I recognize we all love tales of people like Abe, who by luck and by wit survive great suffering. We like to see ourselves struggling against all odds to have a good day at Auschwitz. But in truth, most of us are not Abe, nor, thank God, are we the Volksdeutsch battering the helpless with a shovel. The person in the story I suspect we most resemble is the German farm woman, whose son or husband was in the SS, the woman who lived on the other side of the trees from the death camp, the woman who offered breakfast to Abe and his compatriots with the words, "Tell them we were good Germans." Maybe what draws us to people like Abe is that they've seen the other side and they've come back to tell us and warn us. The other side I refer to is the other side of ourselves. It's interesting that one form of the Hebrew word for heart in the prayer book, lev, is spelled with two bets, in this case pronounced as a V. Double letters in Hebrew are rare. The Talmud in Berachot, chapter 9, explains that the double bet here represents the two sides of the human heart, the impulse for goodness and the impulse for evil. Abe picked up his hand.
Mr. Tobo, I think I have already won. I have some beautiful cards here.
We'll see, Abe, we'll see.
I think you're going to lose. I have this feeling.
Not so fast, Abe. Sometimes you could hope for a lucky draw.
Luck's got nothing to do with it.
Abe downed his shot of whiskey. At this point, I wasn't sure if he was the luckiest or unluckiest man in the world. Abe won with 3 queens. His story made me tremble. I think there's something in it that makes us all tremble. The essential question, are we people of the book or people of the bargain? Willing to do anything in the moment to stay on the right side of the barbed wire? In the final analysis, there may be nothing more true in understanding human evil than Abe's declaration, "They tortured us because they could. Because they were bastards." That simple. And I'm hoping there's also some truth in his boast, "Luck's got nothing to do with it." There is an old Cherokee story of a boy who comes to his father. He's had a nightmare. He tells his father he dreamed of 2 wolves fighting. The father listens and explains to his son that we all have 2 wolves battling inside of us. One is strong and kind and good. He is compassionate and loving. The other wolf is vicious, murderous, greedy, and jealous. They fight all night and they fight all day. The little boy is terrified and asks his father, "Which one wins?" The father answered, "The one you feed." I finished converting Abe's pages and my notes into a patchwork story of his life. I drove to his place and read it to him. I wanted him to have the chance to change anything I'd misunderstood or fill in any of the blanks. Abe was delighted. He loved the story, especially the parts where he was kissing girls. A week later, I recorded it. I burned a CD and brought it over to Abe along with the printed copy of the story as a souvenir. We listened to it together. Abe laughed at his observations about his auto mechanic. He whispered to me, "It's true. He tried to charge me $1,100 for a light bulb. The man is a criminal." I was happy. It was a difficult story to get. It took 2 years, cases of Canadian Club, pounds of week-old apple cake, but I got it. Rather, I got it to Abe's satisfaction. The next morning, Sharon called me. She was a friend of Abe's from the synagogue. She often invited him over for Sabbath dinners. He had taken on the role of honorary grandfather in their home. She was crying so hard she was choking on her words. All I could understand her say was, "Found Abe this morning. Died in his sleep." I rushed over to Abe's apartment. People from the synagogue were there. Here are the facts as I understood them. Abe threw a party. He invited several friends over for drinks and to listen to the CD. The party ended around midnight. Abe went to sleep. Our rabbi asked me to write a few words about Abe. a eulogy. What do you say about Abe? I kept coming back to the same theme. How do we measure a man? How do we measure a life? Abe was a fellow you would not have given much thought to if you passed him on the street, unless he was trying to cross in front of your car and you wanted to turn right. Then you would probably be muttering to yourself for him to move it along. If you measure a man by what he endured, Abe endured plenty. If you measure a man by his business achievements, Abe owned a candy store in New York, liquor store in Los Angeles. Over a drink he would tell you of past business partners, both honest and dishonest. Stories of the dry salami he hid behind the beer cooler as a snack. This is no small point. Dry salami to Abe was the representation of heaven on earth. He told me about the night he was robbed at gunpoint in the liquor store. The gunman told him to lie face down on the floor, and how he said to himself calmly, "So this is it for me. This is it for Abe. I'll never get to tell my wife and son I love them again." But he survived that night as well. One day, we were having a drink. Abe showed me his coin collection gathered from years of selling candy and beer. He showed me a dime. I looked at it. It was a dime. I tossed it back to him. "Yeah, this is great, Abe. With this dime and $2, I could buy a Pepsi at the 7-Eleven.
You could do that, Mr. Tobo, but the joke would be on you. Now look at it again.
I did. It was just a dime. He took it from me and turned it over. He said,
"So what do you see?"
Tails.
He turned it over.
"Now what do you see?"
I see tails. Tails! Oh my God! There are 2 tails! There's no heads!
You can buy a Pepsi with this if you want. They'll take it. But the man at the coin store said a mistake like this is rare. This dime is worth at least $30,000. Imagine that. There's a whole future for my son in this dime.
Abe was like that dime. You had to look closely. Maybe he was some kind of cosmic mistake that could find love at Auschwitz and grace in a piece of apple cake. In the end, I think the measure of any person is in the gulf left in the hearts of those he or she has left behind. I will miss Abe's smile, and his stories, and his unrelenting good humor. Abe always used to ask me the same question from his boyhood, the unanswered question when his studies were interrupted one afternoon by the arrival of the Nazis. 2 men are walking in the woods. They find a lost talus. What do they do with it? Does either one take it based on the amount of time they spent in Jewish study or on the amount of money they had? Do they cut it in 2? I found one answer in the Talmud. Oh, Abe, I hope you can hear me. The answer is none of the above. It's a trick question. No one keeps it. A talus is holy and should be returned to the synagogue or the nearest holy place. In my loss, I find comfort in knowing that Abe too was holy and has only been returned.
This is A Good Day at Auschwitz by Stephen Tobolowsky, directed by Annalise Erikson, starring Alan Mandell as Abe and Stephen Tobolowsky as himself. Senior producer, Annalise Erikson. Prepared for audio by Mark Holden. Recording engineer, Neil Wogensen. Sound design by Mark Holden and Charles Carroll. Mixing engineer, Charles Carroll for the Invisible Studios, West Hollywood. Senior radio producer, Ron Lipkin. Foley artist, Jeff Gardner. Editors, Neil Wogensen and Charles Carroll. Coming up, a conversation with the playwright.
Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Loewenberg, producing director of LA Theater Works, with a very special guest.
I am Stephen Tobolowsky, playwright, actor, and the author of A Good Day at Auschwitz.
For those very few of you who are unfamiliar with Stephen's work, he has over 200 movie and TV credits to his name. A brief list includes his roles as Principal Earl Ball in The Goldbergs, Action Jack Barker in Silicon Valley, amnesiac Sammy Jankis in Memento, and of course, the unforgettable Ned Ryerson in Groundhog Day. And somehow, Stephen, you have time to be a playwright, author, and podcast host. What drives you to be a performer and a storyteller?
I think catastrophe. I have a string of catastrophes that have driven, in specific with storytelling. I began in earnest when I broke my neck riding a horse on the side of an active volcano in Iceland. They have huge storms that come off of the Atlantic, and my wife and I were riding up there, and this storm lifted me and my horse off the ground, carried us about 10 or 20 feet, dropped me, and the horse thought that was God saying, "Giddy up," and I was thrown onto a lava flow. I came back to the United States, and they told me I had a fatal injury, of which I didn't. Thank goodness.
Clearly not.
Words have meaning. When the doctor said fatal and I was alive, I knew he was lying. But I thought the only thing you could do when you have a broken neck is sit. And the only thing you could do creatively while you sit is write. So I thought maybe what I would do is pretend what the doctor said was true. And I died on that mountain in Iceland, and I began writing true stories from my life for my kids. So they would know something about their dad. And true to form, now I have 99 episodes of the Tobolowsky Files podcast, 2 books with Simon & Schuster, this play with you, and my children have still never read one of my stories, not once.
Well, thank goodness for the horse, and thank goodness for the storm, because it unleashed an incredible creative drive in you, which we are all very, very thankful for.
In Iceland, if you have a horse that does that to you, it's usually turned into sausage the next day.
And?
I'm not saying anything. It wasn't my horse. But his name was A Little Bit of Red. That was his name in English, Icelandic. Hate that horse. Hate him.
Well, let's get to A Good Day at Auschwitz. The title itself sounds like an oxymoron. Mm-hmm. How did people react when you first said you were writing a play with that title?
Yeah. The first response was, is this some sort of bad joke? And then I had a very powerful response from a family in Germany who began hearing me tell this story on the internet in Germany. And he wrote me. And his response was, at first, he and his wife were horrified and furious at the title. And they had to listen to the story to see if I was a lunatic or what. And they said they ended up sitting on the floor with their groceries, crying. And they said, "Thank you for writing the story. We appreciate it." So, as you know, when you hear the story, it's the only title it can have. But yeah, people were a bit turned off by it at the beginning.
I remember when Alan first gave me the play, and I thought, oh, this is very unusual. But of course, as I absolutely trust Alan, he said, you have to read this. And of course I did. And that was it. I loved it. It's beautiful.
Well, thank you.
Yeah. In the play, you start off by saying you love the Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead, not only for its soothing rhythms, but because it meant the service was about to end. Did you grow up in an observant household, or?
Oh, heavens, no, no. It's interesting. It's an interesting question, though, because my father and my mother both came from Orthodox families, and there's, I guess, I'm getting an idea, some sort of attrition that happens when there's 10 children in a family. And usually the oldest child gets all of the religion, and then there's a little bit less to each, and each were the babies, mom and dad. So we grew up in Oak Cliff, which is about 25 miles outside of downtown Dallas. And and I'm not exaggerating here, there were more Nazis in our community than there were Jews. There were home to 3 Jewish families, so none of us wanted to let anyone know we were Jewish, especially my parents. They were terrified of our neighbors and of things that could happen to us if anyone knew. So we barely scraped through with maybe going to the High Holy Day services once a year. And my mother felt guilty about this. And so she made sure all of us kids went to Sunday school, which was 30 miles away at the Reform Synagogue. And when we got into confirmation, that's twice a week, 30 miles there, 30 miles back, twice a week. So we got our Jewish education.
So as an adult, had you been going to services before you went to honor your late mother?
I always promised Mom. I always promised her I would go back to the synagogue. And I always just lied. You know, I was out here in Los Angeles trying to be an actor, and I never did it. And I ended up doing a movie in North Carolina with actor, writer, comedian Larry Miller. Brilliant. Larry is so brilliant. He said, "Stephen, are you Jewish?" And I said, "Yeah." He says, "You know, you ought to come by my synagogue. You know, you and me, we'll be buds. You know, we'll just sit there in the synagogue. You'll love this rabbi," who was Rabbi Meyer Schimmel, who I've written about in my stories as well. And that is how I got back into Judaism, by going with Larry. And then I ended up going every Saturday for like 10 years. And I knew nothing about Judaism, really. I was embarrassed how little I knew. But Meyer Schimmel was an amazing, generous teacher. And always after Sabbath services, he would invite me back to lunch. And he'd say, "Stephen, I have a question for you." And he would read a psalm, and he'd go, "No, don't answer me now. Next Saturday, when we come back, I want you to tell me what the psalm really means." And then he would teach me a little line of Hebrew. And after 10 years, I ended up helping him with Yom Kippur services.
When Abe pulls up his sleeve to show you his prison camp tattoo, you say, "I was unable to speak for a moment."
Yeah.
Can you tell us what went through your head when you saw it?
The nightmare, I think we're all transfixed by the nightmare. And it seems like every generation has had one or two nightmares. I know in my life there's been Vietnam and there's been AIDS, COVID. But very few nightmares transcend generations. Those numbers tattooed on your arm from a Nazi death camp has transcended several generations now, 3 generations at least, of the horror of this kind of extinction. And I guess my mind went blank, and all I could think of was, oh my God, the nightmare is real. And here is somebody who's lived through that nightmare. Amazing. So it was a combination of horror and amazement. Yeah.
So before you'd met Abe, did it ever occur to you that someone could be so upbeat about life after going through the horrors of a concentration camp?
Never. It never. And you have to understand Abe. Abe was sunshine. This man could light up the darkest night. He's full of jokes, full of humor, full of love for everything. And to think that he went through all of that in his life, and it didn't break him at all.
When you first went to the synagogue, and there were, I guess, 10 men there because they had a minyan, how did you and Abe actually connect? I mean, did he reach out to you?
You know, sometimes we betray a lot with a little, and he could tell by the way I was saying the Kaddish in such an uncertain way, but in such a determined way, that I was probably saying the Kaddish for my mother. And he said, I could tell it was not for your wife, nor for a child. And
Yeah.
amazing. And and he's the one who said, why don't we have breakfast sometime and talk? He extended the invitation.
And what was your reaction when he said that?
Sure. As an actor and someone who was a stranger in a strange land in a synagogue, I decide, I usually say yes to most invitations. And I thought, well, maybe I'll get to know more about Judaism and more about the Kaddish and more about this from this person here. He's so friendly. He's so full of joy. Little did I know how much I would learn about Judaism from this man.
You and Abe spoke about your shared Polish background. Did meeting him inspire you to delve into your own family's history?
Surprisingly, no. But I have to say that my wife and my brother's daughter both were very much into finding about genealogy. And one thing that happened this last year, which was startling, is that a large group of our family went back to Poland, to the community where they grew up. And the citizens, my family couldn't get out of the bus because the citizens were angry and had gotten the sheriff because they were afraid the Jews were coming from America to take back the property which was stolen from them during the war. Amazing.
Amazing.
That was last year. That was last year.
Say, after all those years.
After all those years. Because what happened, of course, when the Jews were taken from their homes and taken to extermination camps, the Poles who lived in town said, well, I like that house. I'll move over into that house. And they just took the property. And so now they were afraid that the bill was due. So, in other words, it's a wound that has not healed.
When Abe encourages you to have 3 shots of schnapps because, quote, 2 is like 1 is like none, so it's best if you start with 3. He sounds like a poet. Did he often come out with gems like that?
He was always full of jokes. Now, the one thing about that toast, I felt like it was something that was not generated by Abe, but maybe even generations before Abe. It sounded like an ancient toast from his family. You can't have 1. You can't have 2 because 2 is like 1, which is like none, so you might as well start with 3. He had one that really stuck with me, that he told me, you want to grow up to be as good as Golden. And I said, you mean as good as gold is the expression. He goes, no. Our expression is as good as Golden. Because in our town, we had a man who moved into our town named Golden. He was a big man, very big, and I got the idea from his description. He was like Hoss Cartwright or something. Big, strong guy who went into town, and if anyone picked on anyone in the town, they would go to Golden, and Golden would go and make the wrong right and would protect the people in the town. And so the expression is, you want to grow up to be as good as Golden.
That's wonderful. You had the pleasure of working with one of our great stage actors, Alan Mandell, whose incredible career covers everything from collaborations with Samuel Beckett to the Coen brothers. Not to mention, of course, a long list of fabulous, fabulous performances with LA Theater Works. How did you get him involved in the play, and what was it like to work with Alan?
Well, the last part first. Anytime you get to work with Alan Mandell, you are a lucky, lucky person. The man, absolutely. He's a genius. He's a man of the theater. He is one of the bedrocks of the theater, having worked with Beckett, and one of the first people who were shouting the trumpet for Samuel Beckett. Oh my gosh. And the way I got into it is that my wife and I were some of the first actors at Los Angeles Theater Center downtown with Alan. And that's where we met Alan. As Alan, we were all actors in the company, and Alan was always so much more. And when I was turning A Good Day Auschwitz into a play, And that kind of evolved when I wrote My Adventures with God for Simon & Schuster. And my agent said, you know, that Good Day at Auschwitz could be a movie. Why don't you write a screenplay and I'll see if I could sell the screenplay when we sell the book. So I wrote this screenplay and my wife is reading the screenplay and she said, you know, Stephen, this is a play, not a screenplay, and you have to call Alan Mandell. He's the only person who could play Abe. So you have to call him immediately before you even write the play. Show him the story and try to nail Alan down. So I just feel so blessed to be able to work with Alan on this.
He's an incredible actor with an unbelievable memory.
Oh my gosh.
People do not reach Alan's age with a memory like that.
No.
He is like an elephant. And of course, he's also a great tap dancer. I don't know if you knew that.
He's told me about his tap dance lessons. He's shown me his tap dance shoes. We rehearsed this a lot over at his house before the shutdown, and then we began to do it on Zoom after the shutdown to work on it. But he has threatened that after the world opens up again, he will dance for me. And I want to see that. Oh, I do want to see it.
Oh, it's a treat. I'd like to get back to your book, My Adventures with God.
What happened was, if you start off with my stories, I began writing these true stories about my life after the broken neck. And these stories, part of them became the first book, which is The Dangerous Animals Club. But what happened was I don't write stories in chronological order because I think it's kind of a false construct. We don't think that way. We kind of go all over time when we do this. So a lot of what Adventures with God are the Act 1s or Act 3s of stories that I already told in Dangerous Animals Club. For example, in the Dangerous Animals Club, I talk about the first girl I ever proposed marriage to, Alice Nell Allen, when I was 5 years of age. And she said yes. And she kissed me on the cheek, and I gave her some flowers and ran home and told Mom and Dad that I was getting married soon to Alice, and I'd probably be leaving the house and starting my own family. So
and how old was Alice?
Alice was 5 as well.
Oh, I see.
So I have this story in the Dangerous Animals Club. In My Adventures with God, I have a story called The Interrupted Romance. And my brother read Dangerous Animals Club, and I told him, gosh, I wonder what Alice is doing. He says, oh, Stephen, I just saw Alice Nell Allen at a funeral, and she wants to talk to you. And I said, well, I know I proposed marriage to her when she was 5. He goes, yes, she remembers. Stephen, call her. She wants to talk to you about that. And so Alice, in Adventures with God, we have the phone call that I had with her. I'm trying to figure in when I wrote, like 4 years ago, before Adventures with God, in which she told me what was really happening in her home at the time. And she was being beaten. She's being physically abused. And that she looked at our home and our life as this shining example. Her mother would come in and point a gun at her and say your prayers. Tonight is the day you're going to die. And they, like I said, we lived in this white flight area of outside of Dallas. And they had a black nanny, a black maid, Claudie. And Alice told me in the phone call, when Claudie saw the way she was treated, Claudie would not leave the house. And she challenged the parents. And she said, don't you touch a hair on this child's head, or you're coming through me. Now you behave, you go back to bed. And Claudie would stay with Alice and protect Alice. And Alice told me she was the bravest person she ever knew. And when she turned 18, Alice left her home, never to go back again, never to talk to them again, but she went to Claudie She said she was my true mother, and she paid for Claudie's health expenses. She helped Claudie through the end of her life and was with her at her funeral. She was at Claudie's funeral. And so Adventures with God has these spiritual stories, like the story with Abe, that a lot of them were beginnings and ends from other stories I've told. But the point is we encounter the spiritual in ways we don't expect to, not in synagogue or in church or with a prayer book in her hand, but with a phone call with Alice Nell Allen.
Yeah.
It's having matzo ball soup with Abe at the deli is how we really encounter the Spirit in our lives. And it's right there for us. It's offered to us to where we could see the way life should be lived. And so that's kind of the stories in my adventures with God. Again, all true stories.
Extraordinary. I'm overwhelmed by what you just said.
No, it's too much.
I need a second to recover. I do have to ask you about your iconic role as Ned Ryerson in Groundhog Day. Did you have any idea that the movie would become iconic? And do people still stop you on the street and call you Ned?
Again, I'll answer the second part first. Yes! And that's the one good thing about the pandemic with the mask. I don't get asked 3 times a day. Can you say Bing? Has anyone ever asked you to say that? I go, yes, like 2 other people just this morning. So with the mask, at least I'm able to go to the store.
One more question about your play.
Yes, ma'am.
You say in marking his passing that Abe was holy and has only been returned. How did Abe change the way you look at the world? And has his optimism carried you through dark times?
His optimism has certainly carried me through every day of my life since I met Abe. You know, it's a funny thing about the word holy. The word holy, as it's translated in the Hebrew Bible, is kadosh, but kadosh doesn't mean holy. It was the translators of the Bible later who gave it that word. In Hebrew, kadosh only means separate. And that there are some things that are part of the everyday and some things that are separate, that have no connection to time. And that is what Abe was. He had no connection to time. His joy, his optimism, his love of life transcended the normal schedule of days, hours, minutes, weeks, months. And that is one reason why he is so holy, and that is the essence of life that he taught me is so holy. It transcends time. And that's one thing I really learned from Abe.
Well, that's a very beautiful, beautiful memory. Thank you for sharing that with us.
My pleasure.
So this has been great, Stephen. I really, really appreciate your being here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you, Susan.